Thank you, Tammy, thank you, Brian, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going back to my roots as a Victorianist. It's very exciting. The Mill-Taylor marriage has been subjected to an unusual degree of scrutiny. From the moment of their meeting in 1830 and subsequent marriage in 1851, historians, literary critics, and economists have tried to understand why the father of modern liberalism fell in love with the wife of another man and credit her as the author of their best ideas. F.A. Hayek painstakingly collected and published their correspondence in the 1950s and revived old speculation about their relationship. Critics responded by calling Harriet Taylor, pictured on this slide, the object of Mill's affection, both hard and insensitive, and, quote, one of the meanest and dullest ladies in literary history. Mill earned the epitaph of pathological and delusional, that's a quote, and emotionally disturbed for loving her. Clearly this relationship had hit a nerve. What could possibly inspire this kind of nastiness about somebody else's marriage? Its unconventionality was only part of it. Mill put his wife on equal footing with him intellectually, and even more striking, he made no secret of his reliance on her for his ideas and emotional well-being. The interdependence that characterized this marriage generated new ideas about the relationship between the individual and civil society. It offered a version of Victorian domesticity that made the production of knowledge a joint affair. Critics 100 years later, and still today as we see in this New Yorker cartoon of the couple, could not reconcile the reality of an intimate intellectual partnership that produced some of the most enduring tenets of modern liberalism. Excavating the Mill-Taylor relationship renders visible the working out of the marriage question. Scholars have shown that challenging marriage meant challenging gender inequality starting in the Enlightenment. Davidoff and Hall revealed how marriage mattered to the Industrial Revolution. But we know less about its role in intellectual life. The interest in marriage as a social and economic institution has obscured the question of how these unions determine particular cultural and intellectual cross-currents. This was an odd sort of romance, an embrace of feminist utopian idealism of the late 18th century by two people who would decide to uphold the status quo. Rather than challenge marriage like Wollstonecraft and Godwin, they made it accommodate their own desires and circumstances, fully acknowledging its limit on individual freedom. In an essay, The Nature of the Marriage Contract, Harriet defined marriage as a, quote, legal obligation which makes the person of one human being the property of another. Dependence, she argued, should be a choice. One of the mysteries of this relationship is why, after John Taylor dies in 1949, they bothered to get married at all. Waiting for what they considered an appropriate 2-year mourning period, they married in 1851. This propriety seems even stranger in light of their clear disdain for the institution and the conditions under which they met. Their flexible marriage played itself out as more than an experiment, I would argue. It shaped their intellectual lives. Harriet Taylor wrote of her happy courtship with Mill in 1837, not long after they met, characterizing it as, quote, sparking. Love letters were interspersed with talk of politics, political theory, and publishing. In a long letter addressed to Mill at India House, she referred to the 10 Hours Bill as a matter of, quote, personal liberty, a fundamental law if there was any, and accused politicians of violating this principle in Ireland. Opinions on Paris in 1848, as well as comments on a piece Mill wrote about suffrage with, quote, some few pencil marks attached, followed. Well before their actual marriage, these exchanges of love, political commentary, and work in progress tied them to one another and shaped their thinking. In 1849, they spent some time together in Pau, France, where Mill hoped to recover from a serious eye condition. There, Harriet received word that John Taylor was gravely ill. She left France for her husband's bedside. Quote, I have a great hope that by my care he will get over this bad state, she wrote to Mill. But I see that all depends on keeping his spirits, and nothing does this but my constant presence. I'm very tired and have not been able to find a moment in which to write. Mill, in the meantime, had returned to London and his job at India House, where he waited to hear from her. She consulted Mill about her husband's condition, and he sent her medical texts, pills, and advice on John Taylor's care. In turn, she suggested changes to the new edition of Political Economy, offering encouragement and edits. I'm not quite sure how she could do this, but she was weighing in on one of the fallouts that Mill had with one of his critics. She writes from her husband's bedside, "I wish that he should see or feel that you are not humbugged by him." Blaming stupid doctors, that's her quote, for Taylor's pain and suffering, she reflected, quote, "How I wish I knew if there was anything more that could be done." Holding out hope, she refused to leave her husband's bedside. But nerves had started to fray. When Mill asked for sympathy about his own ailments, she reminded him of their reality. Quote, "I should be anxious about your health, dearest, if I felt time to be anxious or think of anything but to try to relieve him. Alas, I feel as if he besides you is the only life I value in this wretched world." For his part, Mill felt forgotten and complained that she wrote to him at, quote, "odd time." Harriet barely contained her anger, replying, "I told you that I have not a moment unfulfilled by things to be done when not actually standing by his bedside or supporting the invalid. Good God, should you think it a relief to think of somebody else, some acquaintance, or what not while I was dying? My heart is wrung with indignation and grief." Another letter concluded, quote, "If I am to lose him, I shall lose the best and most dearly loved friend, and one of the most upright, generous, true, and good men that ever lived." Harriet Taylor's assertion that they were all in this together suggests not a love triangle as much as an alternative family arrangement. A less sexy configuration, to be sure, but one that explains how these three individuals accommodated socially unsanctioned feelings of fealty, love, and commitment. Importantly, family and friends tolerated this arrangement, supporting her in the role as wife, nurse, mother, and lover during her husband's illness. This elasticity sheds light on the private context where marriage accommodated unconventional arrangements. They were not the only ones who tested marriage's flexibility. Consider George Eliot or even W.J. Fox, who had introduced Taylor and Mill and lived in a not dissimilar arrangement to them. During John Taylor's months-long illness in 1849, Harriet made her loyalties to her husband clear by setting boundaries with Mill, but this came at a psychological price. Many of her letters from this period are written in almost illegible pencil, suggesting signs of frustration and maybe even confusion. This letter to Mill contains squiggly lines that take up most of the page on the bottom. I think you can see it. The first of these lines look like they're trailing off and then transform into looping, wavy lines. She didn't cross anything out. She just finished the letter in nonsensical, indecipherable markings. 3 days later, she asked Mill not to, quote, call for a week. She managed her husband's affair after his death that July in consultation with Mill, including his burial. Taylor left most of his property to his wife, and in this way, he showed his loyalty to her as well. J.S. Mill and Harriet Taylor wagered on the lottery, marrying on April 21st, 1851 in Dorset. The lead up to the event served as a reminder of how closely their commitment to one another was tied to their politics. Mill, feeling, quote, impatient for the time that we shall have a home till we are together in our life, wrote a letter before the wedding to buoy her, and possibly himself, about, quote, living to see something decisive really accomplished on the issue of women's rights and the abolition of slavery. He offered details of the recent Convention of Women in Ohio and expressed hope that marriage would end, quote, this depressing coming and going. Scholars have struggled to characterize this marriage, which was so clearly defined by its intellectual attachment. Was this an intimate but sexless friendship or love affair? The fact of their marriage meant that they took the institution seriously, so seriously, that Mill worked himself up into a state, thinking that signing the marriage registry, quote, J.S. Mill, rather than John Stuart Mill, would, quote, affect the legality of our marriage. He asked Harriet to consent to a church wedding, which, despite changes in the marriage law, recent changes, legitimating civil unions, John believed would secure their status as man and wife. Quote, the sooner it is done, the better, he wrote. She reassured him that this was not necessary. A week after the wedding, where 2 of Harriet's children served as witnesses, they returned to London and continued to work on an article entitled Emancipation of Women. What allowed them to imagine that they would be able to operate in the bounds of an institution that Harriet Taylor had compared to slavery in 1848? The steady secularization of the institution meant that marriage began to be seen as a contract even before the Married Women's Property Acts increased married women's financial independence, and the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce more possible. Mill's youthful embrace of romanticism and romantic poetry encouraged the belief in natural affinities, and I think this mattered too. It opened up a space to question traditional marriage practices without rejecting its social, religious, and emotional legitimacy. The Mills did not accept marriage as inevitable, but embraced it because they saw it as useful to legitimating a relationship that had existed under a cloud of suspicion since they first met. Marriage, however, created its own problems. Mill's family did not approve of his marriage to, quote, Mrs. Taylor, they kept calling her Mrs. Taylor, resulting in a rift that lasted until well after Harriet Mills' death, in 1858. The names, so many Johns. Harriet Martineau snubbed them, as did other old friends and acquaintances who believed Mill made a fool of himself by courting John Taylor's wife. They combated this hostility by insisting on their privacy and freedom to choose married life on their own terms. Quote, we have used a right which the whole world, of whatever shade of opinion, accords to us, Harriet wrote in response to her brother-in-law George's objection to their marriage. Who asked you to form an opinion? John Mill asked his brother, defending his years-long relationships with the Taylors, and his justification is interesting. Listen to what he says to his brother George. What imaginary principles are they which should prevent people who have known each other the greater part of their lives, during which her and Mr. Taylor's house has been more a home to me than any other, and who agrees perfectly in their opinions, from marrying? I guess that's logical. For all his appeals to propriety, Mill was no traditionalist. He denied his legal right as a husband in a contract that stated in part that the wife, quote, retains in all respects whatever the same and absolute freedom of action and freedom of disposal of herself and of all that does or may belong to her, as if no marriage had taken place. So he sees her as an independent, non-married woman in the bounds of their marriage. This radical moment, women's rights conventions and the sparks of first wave feminism, inspired them to think of marriage as a contract that protected their mutual interdependence. It also framed political subjectivity as interdependence, an idea that would later show up, if you read closely, in On Liberty. Ultimately, marriage created the conditions for husband and wife to strengthen and advance their intellectual collaboration. Mill really liked being married. On the day he started his diary a couple of years after he wed, he wrote, quote, what a sense of protection is given by the consciousness of being loved, and what an additional sense over and above this by being near the one by whom one is and wishes to be loved the best. Very sweet. This desire to protect the sense of safety may have animated their decision to settle on the edge of London. In September 1851, they chose a large two-story home set off from the road and obscured by a tree-lined path at the end of the railway line. Blackheath, situated amidst green fields and farmland, was at that time one of the most distant suburbs of the metropolis. The completion of Blackheath Station that same year made it possible for John Stuart Mill to commute to his job in central London. Harriet, who had long complained about associating with those who gossiped about their relationship, welcomed the isolation. Mill's mother and sister had spurned her by refusing to visit after their marriage, and this she would not forgive. Rather than allow them to make her socially invisible, Harriet found solitude living with her children as Mrs. Mill in the suburbs. There they raised Helen together and supported the two older boys. Harriet Taylor Mill seemed to like being married too. Her marriage to John Taylor had offered stability and produced 3 children, and possibly a nasty case of syphilis. They seemed to have loved each other despite it all, and she maintained her own kind of loyalty to the union. What she lacked in this marriage, she found in her marriage to Mill. She could engage her intellectual self in a way that she could only do surreptitiously while married to Taylor. For example, during her second pregnancy in 1829, Taylor had granted her permission, on the advice of his father-in-law, a man midwife, to bathe in the sea only under strict conditions. Her defiant response was a poem entitled Mermaid Song, written, you guessed it, in pencil. Oops. Oh, come on. There it is. Written in pencil on the back of an envelope that contained her husband's directive not to bathe in the sea. It read in part, quote, in crystal caves of ocean, you can't see that, I had highlighted it, but you can't see it. In crystal, I'll just read it for you, trust me. It read in part, in crystal caves of oceans deep, I made my pearly home. It seems she did not share this disappearing act fantasy with her husband or ever publish this poem. She could have remained single after Taylor's death. As a widow, however, she would have had financial independence but fewer opportunities to engage in the intellectual life that she pursued while living as Mill's wife and collaborator. Marriage offered stability and a physical space for work. At Blackheath, the Mills' public and private lives were intertwined, making it possible for both of them to pursue their interests. They could control the comings and goings of friends and family because they lived so far outside the geographical boundaries of society, which offered a level of privacy that shielded them from disapproving eyes. Thomas Carlyle's wife, Jane, considered Harriet, quote, a peculiarly affected and empty body. She was not easy, Jane said. Harriet, for her part, had little affection for Jane, who, like her husband Thomas, believed that she had made Mill the fool. Jane recalled Harriet offering a mocking invitation to Blackheath in honeyed tones. Quote, this is Jane quoting Harriet, come down to see us, you will be charmed by our house. It is so full of rats. Rats, cried Jane, do you regard them as an attraction? Yes, they are such dear, innocent creatures, supposedly, Harriet said. Harriet's affected manner was her armor, I would argue, that kept distractions like the Carlyles at bay. I don't know if they ever visited. Blackheath facilitated work both by its isolation and its setup. Here the Mills were ensconced in a domestic life that challenges the trope of the solitary genius. While they would not have spoken of work-life balance at the time, they clearly had it at Blackheath. Mill literally brought his work home. Many of their letters were written on East India Company watermarked stationery, while Harriet probably had her own writing desk, most likely in the drawing room. This is the home today. She used EIC paper in their home library to compose her correspondence and essays. A family grew up in Blackheath that put members in close contact. The house was cold in the winter. Harriet recalled that her room one morning was 38 degrees, and this necessitated that the family gather before the drawing room fireplace many mornings. There was a piano, in which Mill's stepson Algernon recalled hearing him play his own compositions, quote, rich in feeling, when requested by his mother. Family pictures probably sat on the piano, and these are pictures. This is how they look in the LSC archive right now. They're in the box, like these two of Harriet Taylor, and so I'm kind of imagining. Her son describes it as they had pictures on the piano, but like I'm imagining that these two probably sat on the piano, but we don't know. That's still in the archive. The dining room walls, according to Algernon, again, were lined with, quote, tall bookcases surmounted by plaster casts of classic celebrities and a fine engraving of Raphael's Madonna over the mantelpiece. There would have also been room for Mill's herbarium. He was a fanatic collector, and I do mean fanatic collector, of plant specimens that he gathered on strenuous walking tours across England and Europe, many of which, like this one, can't wait to see it. He's a guy who wishes he was famous for something else, I would say. He writes to the gardener at the head at Kew in this period, and he asks him, do you please take my specimens? I really want to discover a new species. So you've got, it's kind of great to hear a father of modern liberalism saying, I just wish I'd discovered that new plant. Mill, and this is at Kew. This is one of his specimens that is being held at Kew, and they have hundreds of them there. It's really quite remarkable to see them all lined up and with his handwriting on them. Mill must have liked the setup at Blackheath because he replicated it at Avignon, where he lived with his wife after his wife died in 1858. And this is the Mill home in Avignon. The Victorian home used space to, quote, to construct intimacies and distances, and this shaped the Mill household interactions. Families had access to professional spaces in the home. Libraries had multiple places to sit, and members of the family read, wrote, sewed, composed, and played piano. There are few physical traces of the Mill's family life extant today. And while the Blackheath house still stands, you can walk right up to it, no blue plaque is there to guide the curious. The Mill blue plaque is at his family home in Kensington before his marriage, so you wouldn't know this house was the Mill house unless you kind of have to do some detective work. So the traces of this marriage and this home they're not really in the historical record in the same way the Kensington house is. We do not know how the Mills furnished their home exactly, but a well-known contemporary offers clues to how they lived and worked at Blackheath. The house where Charles Dickens during this period, now a museum in Bloomsbury, shows the connections between work and family life in the Victorian home. One Dickens family member recalled observing him writing Oliver Twist in the drawing room in his leather armchair. The library and his writing desk were next to the drawing room, within earshot of shared family space. When Mill worked at India House, he engaged in a regular back and forth with his colleagues and would pace in his large office throughout the day, taking care of visitors and personal business. More than likely, he would have engaged in a similar process with his wife back at home at Blackheath. Domestic arrangements shape the writer as much as the work. They reveal a world that belies the notion of the solitary genius composing great works in isolation. Less a room of one's own than a room near the piano. Travel also mattered. They both traveled extensively, and they traveled together and they traveled apart, but they always kept in close contact. Blackheath was home, and it grounded their wanderings throughout Europe and England. In late 1854, Mill embarked on a 6-month walking and camping tour of Italy and Greece to recover his health. He walked hundreds of miles on this tour. He had consumption, but he believed that walking was going to cure him. He must have made a strange sight to locals camping and walking and collecting flowers. Harriet also suffered from consumption, but she did not go on these walking tours. He wrote to his wife that he believed that their separation would drive him, quote, mad, but he was excited about the idea for a new book on liberty, which he worked on with this during this 6-month hiatus. Quote, I came back to an idea, he writes to Harriet, we've talked about, and thought that it's best to write and publish at present what would be a volume on liberty. He asked for her help from Rome. I wish I had brought with me here the paper on liberty that I wrote for our volume of essays. Perhaps my dearest will kindly read it through and tell me whether it will do as the foundation for one part of the volume in question. If she thinks so, I will try and write and publish it in 1856 if my health permits, as I hope it will. She did, and Mill concluded, quote, I shall think seriously about the book on liberty since my darling approves of the subject. This idea moved him to a nervous state inspired by, quote, the sensation of beauty I am living among and thoughts of domestic life. Asked by a woman if the overflowing armload of flowers he had collected for study and later destined for Kew were for his, quote, Bella, he wrote to Harriet, I wish indeed it had been for my Bella, and a day never passes when I do not wish to bring flowers home to her. They both always came home. In spring 1855, Mill wrote from Corfu to suggest that he take a position there with the English-led administration. She said no, and claimed that continental life would not suit him, as he would miss interactions with colleagues that stimulated his work. She also thought it was too hot. She preferred the English seaside and often went there on her own. For Harriet, these times of separation fed and grounded her, and her husband knew this, as he wrote again from Corfu, "Though the last letter does not say how you are, the handwriting and its being in ink are encouraging." John believed this ink, a sign of physical and emotional strength. Indelible ink revealed a deliberateness that eschewed any uncertainty about the space she occupied on the page. These are not the patterned experiences of the solitary genius locked away in his library or the furtive female scribbler. Rather, marriage facilitated independence and collaboration. Their intellectual life relied on engaging in an intimate, family-centered environment that did not always happen around the actual hearth. Marriage proved a productive space because of this physical and emotional configuration, which made it possible for Harriet to participate in the production of ideas and for the two of them to write. The project they worked on most of during these years was J.S. Mill's autobiography, by design a book not published until after both of their deaths. Neither published very much, though, during their 7.5 years of marriage, but they clearly were working. The autobiography had its own urgency and was written largely to set the record straight about their marriage. As Mill wrote in early 1854, quote, "I too have thought very often lately about the life, and I'm most anxious that we should complete it as soon as possible. Until revised by you, it is little better than unwritten." He worried that it, quote, "contains nothing about our private circumstances, and you only can decide what more is necessary or desirable to say in order to stop the mouths of the enemies hereafter." This attempt to control the narrative was a joint effort, with Mill imploring that, quote, "we must go through this together and add the rest to it at the very first opportunity, in order not to put arms into the hands of the enemy," he wrote. "Every ground should be occupied by ourselves on our own subject." It seems strange that John gave Harriet so much control over his own story. They didn't call it a joint autobiography after all, but as he recorded in his diary around the same time, quote, I owe the enlargement of my ideas and feelings to her influence." Nervous about how to characterize their relationship and eager to avoid, quote, "scandalous suspicion about us," he put the burden on his wife. They cloaked their romance as companionship in a chapter entitled "Commencement of the Most Valuable Friendship of My Life." The marriage produced ideas largely through correspondence and conversation. Taylor Mill, whose writing today is considered part of the canon of female philosophers, produced very few single-authored works. It is telling that she worked so hard on Mill's autobiography in sacrifice of her own work. The overwhelming desire to avoid scandalous suspicions subsumed their intellectual project during these years. Mill's seeming generosity in crediting her with the ideas, though not authorship, may have been a function of his neediness and ego. This made very little space for Harriet to author work independently. After her death, Mill's productivity grew substantially, a self-conscious effort he claims to have embarked upon to honor his wife's memory. Ultimately, wife more ghostwriter than co-author. Harriet died of lung disease in southern France on November 3rd, 1858. John bought a house in Avignon near where he buried her and spent much of his remaining days there with Helen, his stepdaughter and constant companion after her mother's death. In February 1859, he published On Liberty. The dedication reads in part, famous dedication, "To the beloved and deplored memory of her who was the inspirer and in part the author of all that is best in my writings, the friend and wife whose exalted sense of truth and right was my strongest incitement and whose approbation was my chief reward." Similar words were carved in stone on her tomb in Avignon, an echo of the autobiography. Feminist scholars argue that we cannot study Taylor Mill's limited writerly output and intellectual ability in a vacuum, just as we cannot study John Stuart Mill's extensive canon as the work of one person. She engaged politics and philosophy, still realms of knowledge, then not fully accepting of female voices. History had to discover her, though maybe she didn't want to be discovered. She thrived on what she called very little society, and she wrote to Mill, quote, "I know what the world is, and have not the least desire either to brave it or to court it." In the end, her longing for privacy failed to shield her from public eyes. Harriet Taylor Mill did not disappear. F.A. Hayek conjured her up and offered fodder for his critics in his 1951 publication, The Mill-Taylor Friendship, after he became obsessed with the marriage story that I've just related. I'd like to conclude by considering why Hayek needed this marriage to craft his own libertarian brand. Mill's letters were scattered after his death. It's a long story. Hayek, then a professor at LSE, set out to put them together in an archive focused on Mill's relationship with Taylor. He started with those letters first. It's the one that historians work with today and the one that I've relied on for this talk. Hayek, like others before him, grappled with the credit Mill gave to his wife for liberalism's best ideas. He even got a Guggenheim. When I got the application, it's very strange. To retrace their footsteps in France, Italy, and Greece, and supposedly even slept in the room where Taylor died. And he's very proud of that, right? Like, it's in the application. It's strange. Okay, maybe that part is anyway. It would be easy at this point to put Hayek on the proverbial couch and relate to you how his personal life never included a happy moment with a partner. Now that would not be very nice. But there are details of his private and public life that I think help with the story I just related. An Austrian who fought in the First World War, he became disillusioned with socialism and moved to England. Hayek was looking for a hero and an independent male political subject, the quintessential freeborn Englishman, if you will. From here, he could rewrite Burkean conservatism from a passive defense of freedom through maintaining the ancient hereditary rights of the privileged few to an activist, libertarian political agenda inspired by an educated middle-class prophet. Mill mostly fit the bill, but only if he rewrote the intellectual collaboration that took place in the bonds of his relationship with Taylor. Hayek's painstaking reconstruction of what is now known as the Mill-Taylor collection at LSE focused on excavating Harriet Taylor's influence on Mill. Their unconventional relationship had been the subject of much musing and hand-wringing long before Hayek began his work. Soon after Mill's death, one critic wondered, quote, whether Mill's interest in the cause of woman is serviceable to him as a thinker. It has a tendency to develop the sentimental part of his intelligence and has only been kept in due subjection by his respect for his own reason. The observation conveys the sense of embarrassment, and in the case of Hayek, downright obsession. Mill's insistence on his wife's genius, a word used multiple times in the autobiography, shattered the myth of the philosopher working alone, untouched by the life around him. Authorship in this scenario is not individual, but corporate. But for Hayek and others, someone must take credit for a significant work, and this is especially true of a work of philosophy, the undisputed domain of male genius. Mill turned this myth inside out in the autobiography that we now know was essentially co-written by his wife. Its confessional form and Mill's choice to collaborate with Taylor in writing it produced a different narrative of genius. The choice to discuss an interlude of moral self-doubt brought on by a mental breakdown bolstered the claim that his development as a liberal thinker relied on exploring nature and English romanticism, he was reading Wordsworth, while forging human connections. He flipped the script on his own inherited privilege as well. In the autobiography, it minimizes his status as the son of the great James Mill, an inheritor of Benthamite utilitarianism, in favor of a freer, more earthbound identity that relied on intellectual guidance from his partner. In place of his father's influence stood Harriet, severing the parental bond through a marriage that gave him a new origin story and produced a new set of ideas. Embracing corporate authorship and a search for happiness did not easily square with the strident utilitarianism of Mill's father's generation. Mill expressed his theory of, he calls his theory of life after his breakdown, quote, "Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some other object than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself as an end, as an ideal end." I sometimes cite this passage in the autobiography to explain to students the logic of liberalism. Yes, be a good person, contribute to your community, rely on one another. And I realize that this is not how most of us see liberalism these days, through this idealized lens of Mill. Sentiments like this led critics like Hayek to believe that Mill, the romantic, betrayed Mill, the empiricist. Hayek blamed Harriet for this. There were other uncomfortable truths in Mill's writing that Hayek, the father of modern libertarianism, needed to write out of the story. Previous critics had blamed Mill for giving his wife too much credit for the ideas published under his name. Hayek took a different approach. He took Mill seriously when Mill said that many of his best ideas belonged to his wife, but selectively applied Mill's assertion to the ideas that did not fit Hayek's evolving libertarian worldview. You can see him do this in his note cards and his archive. You can see him sort of crossing things out, and it's fascinating. Taylor, Hayek claimed, pushed Mill towards socialist and feminist positions and made Mill's work weaker for it. Feminist scholars since have agreed that Harriet Taylor deserves credit for the ideas in On Liberty and Subjection of Women, but they haven't challenged the heart of Hayek's critique, which aligns feminism from John and Harriet's understanding of liberalism. Hayek's papers now at the Hoover Institution show how he came to this position. He needed an independent liberal male subject to build his anti-socialist agenda, most famously articulated in The Road to Serfdom. It was the marriage that was the problem, not Harriet. The classic Enlightenment subject was a fully formed adult male. This gendered and age-based independence characterized the early liberal project and cast mutuality and collaboration as feminine. Marriage, a fundamentally interdependent relationship, impeded Mill's qualification as the father of Hayek's libertarian project that made male autonomy its hallmark. I think it's telling that Hayek had trouble titling the letters, the Mill-Taylor letters that he collected. He first published them as John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, their correspondence and subsequent marriage, but then immediately issued an erratum changing correspondence to friendship in the title. A new edition published by the Liberty Fund last year dispenses with marriage altogether in its title, calling the volume The Mill-Taylor Friendship and Related Writings, thus rendering the marriage invisible. Now, to be fair, Mill and Taylor had difficulty characterizing their own marriage, but it was theirs to label, not Hayek or the Liberty Fund. It took 1980s feminism to rediscover Taylor as an independent thinker. Nonetheless, she's become an add-on to Mill's thinking at best and remained an encumbrance at worst. Hayek claimed that after she died, Mill went back to the more, quote, sensible ideas of his youth. Hayek, like others before him, blamed Harriet for Mill's engagement with socialism. It's no surprise that when the curriculum included Road to Serfdom at my first job, I scratched my head. I wondered why a class organized around the rise of liberalism did not require On Liberty. At the time, I was writing Women Making News and considered Mill's Political Economy as a central feminist text. As I researched this relationship 25 years later, I finally understood that teaching Hayek was teaching Mill, just a version of Mill that had been sanitized of its radicalism, its socialism, its gender critique. Hayek's libertarianism co-opted Mill and Taylor's liberalism as a 20th century post-war ideology. There could be no romance in freedom. But marriage was more flexible than Hayek wanted to believe. He saw it as a straitjacket that constrained Mill and made him go against his better judgments, making him less free to choose. Only when his wife died could he do the work that he wanted to do. But if we listen to Mill and look closely at the years that he and Taylor had together, we get a different view of how marriage mattered to the intellectual development of liberalism. Mill felt freed, not constrained by marriage. His wife may have agreed, though it was different for her. Defending their choices fell most heavily on her choices, on her shoulders, as indicated by the intellectual labor she dedicated to Mill's autobiography. Harriet saw Mill's years with Taylor as an impediment to the realization of liberal political subjectivity. What he couldn't see was how much the ideals that he himself purported to uphold relied on a feminist socialist agenda that understood freedom as part of a collaborative project that valued interdependence. The Mill-Taylor marriage suggested that this was possible. This talk has not sought to rescue the Mills from the condescension of posterity or to reveal some yet to be discovered truths about the authorship of arguably the most important treatise on modern liberalism. Rather, I wanted to consider tonight the modern liberal idea as a lived experience. Harriet and John found solace, comfort, and creative energy in marriage. Ignoring this leaves us with a less nuanced understanding of both marriage and liberalism. Mill belonged as much to the English romantic tradition as to the utilitarian. The marriage and what it produced revised the utilitarian pragmatism of his father's generation to make room for human connection. I think we've been asking the wrong question. It's not who is responsible for which idea, but rather how did collaboration create a set of intertwined ideas? Feminism and liberalism, born of the same parentage, grew up together. The Taylor-Mill-Hardy throuple did not change marriage conventions. Rather, their arrangement reflected a kind of intimate pleasure bound by legal and cultural constraints. This very Victorian marriage, elastic, interdependent, and productive, was mirrored in other literary couples and probably regular ones as well. There was much unhappiness in this threesome. Doubt, anger, loneliness, and jealousy plagued each of them at one point or another. They pushed the limits of marriage as an institution in a moment when the difficulty of obtaining a divorce in premature invited it. Those who craved more freedom in social arrangements adjusted. Emerged a space for autonomy and private life, forged between husbands and wives, friends and lovers. Liberalism required collaboration between ideas and individuals. From this household came the refinement of a set of principles: equality before the law, limited state intervention in private life, freedom of conscience, what we do and do not owe one another. Hayek and others blunted the material complexity of the liberal ideal by appropriating the bits that sustained a gendered Enlightenment subjectivity. That modern liberalism continues to enshrine the autonomous male as the model political subject is a product of such thinking. Ultimately, this distortion has cast marriage as, at worst, banal economic dependence, or at best, contractual consent. For Taylor, Mill, Hardy, it was not quite that simple. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Let's go have a drink.